And this is Miss Humbert here. Today we're going to be doing Unit 5 Learning Target 11. So we're going to look at the different ways that we have gone through so far for solving quadratics. So when you're solving quadratics, there's three different methods you can use. The first is graphing to find the x-intercepts. So basically when you use the zero product property and the quadratic formula, what you're doing is finding the x-intercepts of a graph. Okay? And so those are the other two options you can use to solve. So factoring, remember that's when we set up the big X and then we factored by grouping. And the zero product property is when we set each factor equal to 0. Next, using the quadratic formula. So when we use the quadratic formula, that's when we use X is equal to opposite of B over 2A. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's take a look at these methods. Okay, so when we do this, what we're going to do first is use the zero product property. So what we're doing is we're going to multiply to 20 and add to 9. So then, I'll multiply to 20 and add to 9, you're going to use 5 and 4. So if you're struggling to remember how to factor and so forth, make sure you talk to me and we can get that fixed, okay? So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to split up my 9x. So instead of having 9x, I'm going to put an x with each of these. So I have 5x plus 4x plus 20 is equal to 0. So now I'm ready to factor by grouping. So I'm going to go ahead and make my two groups. So between x squared and 5x, I can take out an x. So I'm dividing each of these terms by x. X squared divided by x is x, and 5x over 5x is going to be 5. Then between 4x and 20, I can take out a 4. So I'm dividing each of these by 4, and then when I divide each by 4, I get x plus 5. So then the leftovers are matching, so I can factor those out. And once I've factored those out, I can write what's left after that, which is x plus 4. Now that's going to be equal to 0. So in order to get what x is equal to, I'm going to have to set each of those factors now equal to 0. So here I can subtract 5 from both sides. So I end up getting that x is equal to a negative 5. Here I can subtract 4 from both sides, and then I get that x is equal to a negative 4. So here are both my options, negative 5 and negative 4. So that's how you would solve that quadratic using the zero product property. Now let's take a look at solving it using the quadratic formula. So my a is 1, my b is 9, and my c is 20. So we're going to plug that into the quadratic formula. So my x is going to be equal to opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all of that over 2 times a. Again, remember when you're using the quadratic formula, I want you to solve what's underneath the radical first. So 9 squared minus 4 times 1 times 20. So negative 9 plus or minus the square root of 1 divided by 2. So then we're going to do negative 9 plus the square root of 1, and then in my calculator I'm going to hit enter and divide it by 2. And when I do that, I get a negative 4. Then for the minus version, negative 9 minus the square root of 1, hit enter, and then divide it by 2, and when you do that, you get a negative 5. So negative 4 and negative 5 are your final answers for number 1. So let's take a look at this graph. So this is a graph of the quadratic y is equal to x squared plus 9x plus 20. So if you were to go through and calculate out the vertex, you would get this right here for your vertex. Okay? Notice that it's crossing the y-axis at negative 4, or the x-axis, it's crossing at negative 4 and negative 5. So that was our solutions to the problem that we calculated in number 1. They all mean the same thing. So let's try that again with number 2. So for number 2, we're going to set this up for factoring. So we're multiplying to negative 24 and adding to 10. So I'm multiplying 12 and negative 2 in order to get 10. Again, still struggling with the x? Let me know and we can work on it together. So then, instead of writing 10x, I'm going to put 12x and 2x. So then I have 12x minus 2x minus 24 is equal to 0. So now I'm ready to factor by grouping. So I'm going to make my two groups. Between x squared and 12x, I can divide out an x. So I'm dividing each of these terms by x, and then I get x plus 12. Here we have a negative, so that means I want to take out a negative greatest common factor. So what divides 2 and 24? Well, that's going to be 2. So I'm going to divide both of these by a negative 2, and I get x plus 12. So then I'm going to write what's left over in one parenthesis, which is x plus 12. And then once I get rid of that in the other parenthesis, I'm going to do x minus 2. So now I know that x plus 12 is equal to 0 and that x minus 2 is equal to 0. So for this first one, I'm going to subtract 12 from both sides. So I get that x is equal to a negative 12. To solve this one, I'm going to add 2 to both sides. So here I get that x is equal to 2. So now I'm going to go ahead and do that with the quadratic formula, and you can guess that it's probably going to be the same. But let's just check to make sure. So we're going to do opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all of that over 2 times a. So the first thing I want to do is simplify underneath the radical. So I'll do 10 squared minus 4 times 1 times 20. Now when I do that, I end up getting a square root of 196. Notice that the square root is still there. Then I'm dividing that by 2. So now I want to do my positive and my negative version. So first, my positive version, negative 10 plus the square root of 196. And then you're going to hit enter, and you're going to divide that by 2. And when you do that, you end up getting 2. Negative 10 minus the square root of 196, hit enter, and then you're going to divide it by 2. And when you do that, you get negative 12, which is exactly the answers that we got when we did the zero product property. So really, you can be choosing what method works comfortable for you. On this practice sheet, though, I do want you to practice both methods. So then, if you look at this graph right here, you'll notice that it's crossing the x-axis at 2 and negative 12. So again, the solutions to our quadratic are also the x-intercepts of the graph. So now we are going to solve this using the zero product property. But first I want to talk about when factoring doesn't work. So we're going to put that in that box here in a second. So then we're going to multiply to negative 4 and add to 3. Oops, that's wrong. We need to multiply 2 times negative 4, which is going to give me a negative 8. So when you're multiplying to a negative 8 and adding to 3, well, that's simply not possible. That's not factorable. So in that box that says when does factoring not work, what I want you to do is to put that it simply means that you use the quadratic formula. So when factoring doesn't work, you use the quadratic formula. So let's go ahead and let's do that for number 9. Or for number 9 for this one right here. Let's use the quadratic formula. Whoa, that is a crazy marker. So we get x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root, this is kind of fun, of b squared minus 4 times a, which is 2, Miss Humbert, times c, which is negative 4. Okay, fun's over. That's too hard to read. So then we're going to get x is equal to negative 3 plus or minus the square root. So we want to do 5 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 4. Now, when you do that, you end up getting 41 underneath the radical, which is 4. So then, negative 3 plus the square root of 41. You're going to type that into your calculator, then divide it by 4. And that's going to give you 0.85. Then you're going to do negative 3 minus the square root of 41, hit enter, and then divide it by 4. And that's going to give you a negative 2.35. So those are your final answers. So when you're looking at the quadratic, or we could go this way, that's cool. So when you're looking at this guy, you'll notice that it's crossing not at a decimal. Since it's crossing at a decimal, so if the x doesn't work, you have to use the quadratic formula, which is what this says here. So you can put that in your box. So that means that the roots can't be solved, they're not rational, or it's possible that there's no solution. But you can't just jump from it's not factorable to no solution. You have to try the quadratic formula first. So that's what we're going to do here. So we're going to try this one, multiplying to 15 and adding to 2. Well, that x isn't going to work, so it's not factorable. So we have to go and try the quadratic formula. So we're going to get opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all of that over 2 times a. So the first thing I want to do is simplify underneath the radical. So that's going to be 2 squared minus 4 times 3 times 5. Now when I do that, I get a negative 56. And that's going to be divided by 6. Okay, now whenever you have a negative underneath the radical, that's not going to work. So then for this one, there is no solution because it's not factorable and the quadratic formula didn't work. So here, when there's no solution, that means that we never cross the x-axis. So what you want to put in that box with what happens if there's a radical under the negative sign, that means there's no solution. So something to be thinking about as you're working through this is that if there's no solution, the quadratic formula and the zero product property don't work. The quadratic formula, if there is a solution, will always work. The zero product property will work some of the time. So that may play into which method you use. So that concludes the note video for today. Thank you for listening.